Unscripted,
Unbound.
unconditional.
Welcome to the Well Unfiltered.
I'm Mindie,
I'm Nicole,
and we are the hosts of the Well Unfiltered podcast.
where each episode you'll hear unscripted faith stories that will make you think.
Unbound life lessons that will crack you up. I'm talking adjust your waistband laughter.
But most of all, unconditional grace and love that will help you connect to God and to other women.
Welcome to the Well.
Unfiltered. Welcome back to the Well Unfiltered. This week we are going 6 feet deep. You guessed it, we are talking about grief. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been boldly bringing forward those topics that are often filtered out of faith conversations, those things that we don't feel comfortable talking about with so-called church people or in so-called church spaces. And at first glance, it may seem like grief would not be one of those topics because after all, death and grief are some of the things that it looks like the church does reasonably well. And yet, Mindie, you and I have learned that too often we don't feel comfortable discussing grief in faith spaces. And we've learned this not just as pastors, but also as people who have been grieving. And so I wonder if we might start our conversation today with just the way that we've experienced grief. What's your story?
Yeah, so my grief story, I had a couple things come to mind when I was thinking about this. The first one is just the sort of the origin part of my story, which is that my mom died when I was very young. I was 2. And so that was an interesting kind of grief. And we can unpack it a little bit more as we talk. But, you know, it's almost like grieving someone you didn't know. You know, like I look back at pictures of her, but I can't remember her. But not having her in my life shaped everything about my childhood. And even, you know, some of my own mothering today. So that was a really significant grief that I've carried and probably will carry forever. And then this past year, my grandma passed away. And I will say some of the things about that grief really surprised me.
Share more. What surprised you?
So I think I was surprised at how much stuff it brought up. So she was my dad's mom, and my relationship with my dad is pretty fractured. And so it wasn't just grieving a person, and I was grieving her, but it was like grieving a whole family system. And I think sometimes grief it brings some surprises and some extra bags to the trip.
You know, I think of that with my own grief story. There are two losses that are kind of always right under the surface. The first is my sister was murdered when I was in college. And it was, you talk about surprises, it was also not only grieving her life, grieving how it forever changed my family, but also grieving how it fractured my faith. You know, in another episode of The Well Unfiltered, we talked about deconstructing faith. And for me, it deconstructed this maybe childlike Bible school faith.
Like innocence.
Yeah. That how do we wrestle with a God who promises to love and protect us and the reality of evil and violence in the world. And then also beneath that, what does forgiveness look like when you experience that kind of loss? So my faith was absolutely transformed through that experience. And then the other really difficult loss I've experienced in my life was my grandfather, who I have 3 people who were central to my not only spiritual development, but my self-identity. And my grandfather is by far the biggest shaper of who I am. And I say that with intention because every single time I saw him, he would ask me, "Who are you?" And this is not someone that I saw on holidays. I saw him every week.
Like he asked you that every week?
Every single week.
Wow.
And not just me, but every single grandchild. And you would have to then recite, "I am the daughter of who," the child, just this ridiculous recitation. And then he would say, "Take that all away. Who are you?" And you'd have to say, "I'm a child of God." Okay, I'm trying to get in the house. Where's grandma? Like
I'm hungry, I want a snack.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
And that practice created this spiritual core that I didn't even realize until he died, that I felt like, who is going to ask me that question? Who is going to then push me to find the answer? And I was not prepared for that experience. And so those two grief experiences have shaped so much of my faith, but also so much of my mothering, my identity, the way I'm a friend, everything. And so I think that's one of those things that makes it difficult to talk about grief in church, because if grief affects everything, then you can't control it. And I don't know how many of you love emotional outbursts.
It's my favorite thing.
But that's what challenges me about grief and this idea of authenticity and being unfiltered, because grief doesn't, I think, give us a map or a plan.
No, or a timeline or what to expect. There's just I feel like there's no good guidebook for journeying through grief.
Yeah. And so because of that, I wonder if we have similar reasons as to why we found ourselves sometimes filtering our grief in church. Why did you not always feel comfortable talking about your grief experiences in faith spaces or with people of faith?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a twofold answer for me. And the first one goes back to that emotional outburst thing that you talked about, because it's generally frowned upon. But I think for me, one thing that surprised me when my grandma died this year was how closely linked grief and anger were for me. Like I cry all the time at any occasion. So I knew I would cry. Like I knew that, but I didn't know that I would just be pissed. And I was. Okay. And she lived this great long life. Like it wasn't like it was, super unexpected or anything. So I just think I was angry at like maybe all the things in our family that I had to remember the things that were lost or the things that weren't functioning, and it made me mad. I remember being here at work. She died on a Sunday night or a Monday. I was here like at the beginning of the week, and I remember messaging our supervisor and saying, "So I've been here 10 minutes and I'm already angry at everyone. I think I might need to take a personal day." And it surprised me. I didn't realize like what it would dredge up in me. So I think that's one. I think with my mom, it's almost the total opposite end of the spectrum. It's hard to, I don't know how to quite put this. It's hard to receive how people react. When you tell someone that your mom is dead, people are nice and empathetic. So they feel sad for you. They might tear up. And it's hard to know how to navigate that, especially because I lost her so young.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I sometimes keep those things like in my pocket, because it feels like just a lot to sort of wade through. Is that familiar to you, or are your reasons a little bit different?
I can absolutely relate to the challenge of sharing your grief story and then having to not only navigate someone's reaction, but then maybe even having to do emotional work because of their reaction.
Yes.
Especially with the death of my sister, it's like oh gosh, and well, what can I do? Well, actually, I actually don't need you to do anything. I appreciate your empathy. So then there's, I think sometimes this desire to not share so that you don't have to take on that extra emotional work of someone's reaction.
Right.
But I also think, for me, there's when someone dies and it's not natural causes or cancer
Or
or
expected,
something like
right.
that, then there's sometimes a curiosity. And
Yeah.
I remember one of the times where I realized church is not a safe space for me to share my grief. I was at a women's retreat, and there was this really wonderful exercise about offering things to God that we couldn't carry and recognizing that God can carry them. And you had to write them down on a piece of paper. And afterwards, someone came up to me and said, I noticed you seemed really upset, and I just wanted to know, if there's anything I can pray for. And I felt like,
Oh, that's like making me cringe.
yeah, and people know when people are coming in earnest and when people are coming out of curiosity. And I felt like she just wanted to know, why is that pastor so upset? What's going on? What is she trying to let go of? And I didn't want to. This was the exercise. Me, Jesus, not you. You've invited yourself to the table. And so that I think makes me feel like this is not really a safe place. But then there's also this, I think, as a Christian person, and I say as a public Christian, there's this, I think, pressure to perform a resurrected faith, right? So we talk
Oh, yeah.
about our hope in a God who not only was resurrected, but will resurrect us. And, people want to quickly hear that you have that sensibility. So, well, and you'll see, she's looking down on you right now. You'll see her in heaven. I know that gives you joy. And, well, yes, but I'm not feeling particularly joyful at this moment. So then I feel this pressure to perform this resurrected faith for you because I don't want to appear unfaithful. And I think connected to that is I don't want to appear weak. I don't want to appear as if I need that support. And of course, the ironic piece of that is that that's exactly what I need. But I've found sometimes that sharing that in those spaces doesn't meet that need. And that's why I want to unfilter talking about grief, because I think that it's one of the things that keeps people out of growing in their faith journey, being a part of a church community, because we scar people with how we respond to their grief.
I'm sitting here thinking as you're talking that one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn as a pastor, but also just as like a human in the world, is that you just can't fix everything. So my natural default is, you have a problem, you are sad, I'm going to make you better. Like, let me fix you. And I actually noticed it. I did a funeral a few weeks ago, and I showed up at the family's house to meet with them, and I felt myself being in fixer mode. Like, I felt myself like, I'm going to come in, I'm going to be like really happy and, really kind. I'm going to make them feel better. And then I had to like give myself a pep talk and be like, you can't make them feel better right now. And they actually don't need to feel better. They need to feel sad. It's appropriate for them to be sad in this moment. So just take the things that are making you uncomfortable and put them aside and let this be a sad space.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's really hard to let that sad space exist.
And, I experienced this, peak need to sanitize death and grief at my sister's funeral. One of the officiants, and I say one because you've heard in another episode of The Well that
Oh,
I had
yes.
dueling faith traditions. So it took place at a Catholic church, but there was definitely a Baptist minister there too. And so one of the officiants gets up and starts this riff on how the good die young. My sister died when she was 23. And so he starts talking about how young Martin Luther King was when he was assassinated, how young Jesus was when Jesus was. And it was like, not only is this theologically dangerous,
Yeah.
but she was not this, she was an ordinary
Right.
person. And so I was thinking, my little brother was really young. I want to say maybe 6. And I remember him looking around, and I thought, imprinted on his mind right now is that if I'm good, then I may die. I mean, sometimes we don't realize the
Right.
theological statements that we make and how we respond in grief. And I mean, I guess I should have known I was called to ministry then. So then I of course, rebutted him in my remarks, that goodness it is really not what we're discussing here. We're talking about someone's life who was taken, and we need to address as a community why that happened. And as a family, how we're going to recover from that. And we're not going to do it by pretending that she was Martin Luther King and that like this is not helpful. And so I really, really recognize that you can re-traumatize people and create more grief in the way that you respond to grief. And it's so funny when you shared about this funeral. I was someone, I would say about a year and a half ago now, her sister was killed in a hit and run. And she knew that I had experienced this kind of grief. And what made this so difficult was that her mother was going through kind of the early stages of Alzheimer's. And they were trying to explain what had happened. And she wanted me to be there as they were trying to explain it. And I think we all have that fixer mode in us. But after she told her, I said, I'm just going to sit here next to you.
Yeah.
And when you want to say something, then you can say something. But I'm just going to sit here next to you. And I wish someone would have done that for me. And I think that for people that are listening and are wondering, how can I show up in grief spaces? It really may be just to show up and to shut up. And that's really hard. So, keep the God needed an angel, keep the good die young, all of that to yourself, and verbally vomit when you get back in the car.
Right. Right. But I love what you're saying about showing up, because I think that it's like we have these two poles that we oscillate between with grief. Is we either want to say, too much, and that can be really difficult, or we just sort of try to ignore it and pretend it didn't happen. And that, that can be so painful. I know that my Nana, when my mom died, she told me as the years went on, she was like, people just wouldn't say your mom's name. They just didn't want to talk about her. I had another family member that lost a child, and people just stopped talking about him. And it was like, well, they existed, and I'm not forgetting that they were here. Like, if you say their name, it's not going to make me sadder.
Right.
It actually is going to make me feel like, oh, you actually want to honor them or remember them or acknowledge them. And so I do think that's something that we need to remember too, is that not talking about it doesn't make it not a thing.
And also that I think that's such good advice. And also connected to that is that the way that we will honor or remember may look different. I remember within my own family, Some of my family members are, and part of this is my cultural tradition. So my father's from Cameroon, and one of the things I really appreciate about West African culture is that there's not this kind of hiding of grief or death. I remember when we went to Cameroon, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now. Before we went to my grandmother's memorial, we visited every single, place of burial and stood there. I think they poured out palm wine and prayed. And it was just it was this natural thing to move through grief that way. And my grandmother had died years ago. This was not like a current thing. But death dates are celebrated and commemorated regularly. And so that was so different than what I experienced in my the African American side of my family. And so in that way, it was like a party, because at this point, some healing had taken place. And so I'm ready thinking that we're going to be all wearing black. No, like there were outfits ordered. Like this was
it was a whole thing.
This was a thing. And so I think that's one of the things that I've learned, to recognize that the way people move through their grief is different, and that's okay. Because I'm not the person that there's literally a shirt with my grandmother's face on it. Like, and some people that's not my way of dealing with grief. I think that one of the things that I still work through with grief is shame attached to grief. So shame in maybe not feeling like I need to heal in a particular way, and my healing happening in its own authentic way. And I don't always then express my grief the way others do. So my brother every year posts this picture at my sister's graveside. I don't go to the graveside. It's just not my thing. And my dad would get really upset with me. Like, you need to go there and you need to take your children there, because I don't want, again, you to forget her. And it's like, well, in my family, we celebrate her birthday, and we just do that differently. And that's going to have to be okay.
Right.
And so I think that that's one of the things that's hard about grief, especially in faith spaces, because we want people to do it the way we do it.
Right.
Because that's what grief or healing or faith looks like. And perhaps there is space for us to do it in the way that most heals our own hearts and most connects us to God and to one another. And that may look different for different people. As I think about that, I know that we're not the only ones, Mindie, that struggle to talk about grief in an unfiltered way. And I wonder what strategies you would suggest to someone who wants to unburden themselves, but maybe has had those cringeworthy moments with family or at church or wherever they are, and what you would say as they're working to talk about their grief in a more unfiltered way.
Okay, I'm going to give you a practical and then a very spiritual. How about that?
How about that?
So practically, I have because I've journeyed with some people who have gone through some really sudden and unexpected losses, I really believe in the healing space of grief groups. I do. I think that there is something that is just so holy about sitting across the room from someone, and you don't have to convince them or explain. They get it.
Yeah.
They may have not have gone through the exact same thing as you, but they're holding their own grief. And so when you show up with your grief, they're like, yeah, me too. You don't have to explain. You don't have to hide. You don't have to sugarcoat it. And I have just seen those spaces be so incredibly healing for people. So I feel like, finding that group of people that you can just show up and you don't have to explain it to, that is something that I would really recommend. But the spiritual thing that I'd recommend is right now I'm reading through the Psalms. And the truth is, I actually really don't love the Psalms. They're hard for me to it's very strange.
What?
I know. Gasp. Gasp. Everyone's gasping who's listening to this. Because I do love prayer, and I love to write prayers and pray prayers, but reading the Psalms, I think it's hard for me to pay attention sometimes. And I've started I'm trying the spiritual practice of reading them. What I love about the Psalms is they get completely unfiltered about grief. Like, I want you to kill all these people, God. Okay, that's a little much. But I think they just give us words when we don't have words, and they give us permission that, like, we don't have to be people that always show up as this, like, very polished, put together look of ourselves.
Yeah.
Because when we're grieving, like, the ends are unraveling a little bit, and that's actually okay.
Yeah.
That's human.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, what some of the ways that you've leaned into, or that you might, invite others into.
I would say two things. I agree with you. As I like that format of something practical and something spiritual. And my something practical, even I've experienced grief groups, and they were really helpful for me. But then also grief counseling, one-on-one. And I think that that's a gift that we don't give ourselves.
Yeah.
I didn't start grief counseling until I was in seminary. So that was 3 years later. And I think that I felt like, oh, I have all these things to do. I need to keep moving forward, and that your grief will catch up with you if you don't make space for it. And so it really caught up with me in seminary. When you wrestle about who God is, and you're carrying grief, you need someone to help you carry that load.
Yeah.
And then I think the second thing would be to open your eyes to the unexpected people who can be healers. And I say that because I think that I expected to find that my grief would be attended to primarily in church, in the physical building of the church. And even as I think about this podcast, my prayer is that this connects with millions of women around the world, some who are connected to churches and some who will become connected to faith by way of these conversations. And there were 2 women when I was in seminary who were not connected to my church at all, of different faith traditions, who were healers in my life. I think it's Henry Nouwen. If not, Google it and tell me I'm wrong. But there's some person who talks about wounded healers. And
I think it is Henry Nouwen.
okay,
I'm
thank
pretty
you.
sure.
All right. And one of them gave me a book and that talked about that. And it was so healing, this idea that my grief could actually help me be a wounded healer for someone else. So just to not close your eyes to where those unexpected places of healing may be. One of them was a barista at the coffee shop that I lived on top of, and always saw me coming in with this grief book, and it just struck up a conversation. But I will say that I had to recognize that healing could come from that space and open myself up to that. So that's what I would encourage to those that are listening. And then I think the final thing, and I said I was only going to have 2, but like all
bonus.
preachers,
Yep.
I just
We're
lie.
gonna end
No, we're
in
not.
10 minutes.
Yes. In fact, our video production extraordinary person, David Jewell, is looking at me like, I told you to wrap it up.
I know. He gave us the
10
5-minute
minutes ago,
warning a while ago.
It's off the
okay.
rails. But this is a thing I think is so important. It took me probably 10 years to recognize that I'm going to have this grief my entire life. And not because I'm always going to miss my sister, but that the way that that grief shows up is going to look different. So when I had my first child, it was like this wave of grief hit me again. I'm experiencing something that my sister never got to experience. When I got married, I really, I'm sure, made my husband contemplate divorce because on the honeymoon, I woke up in the middle of the night screaming. And he's like, like,
what is happening?
And I realized that I had this repressed grief because everyone kept saying to me at the wedding, you're the first daughter to get married. And I kept feeling like, no, like it's actually not supposed to be this way. And so it's okay. What used to shock me is that I thought I was over this.
Or that you should be
Or
over
that I
it.
should be. That's even better. But then now I expect, it's okay for me to experience this. And that grief is going to continue to find its way, but so is the healing on top of that. So I think as I see David's evil eye, and we should end, and our last question is what's filling your well. See, I'm ending.
David's really nice,
He
by the
is,
way.
yes. This is a total mischaracterization. It's us. We are the evil ones. I think what's filling my well is seeing the ways in which my sister and my grandfather's legacy lives on in my family. So my children, there's one that for sure is mine. I mean, there's like, she looks like me. The other two, they did come out of my body, but they look nothing like me. And you were shaking your head, Mindie. You've seen them.
I've seen them,
They
I
look
know.
nothing
And I
like
have
me.
a child like this too, so I get it. I do.
And my daughter, my sister had light brown hair and green eyes. And none of us have light brown hair. My daughter Olivia does. And my daughter has her eyes. And she'll ask me sometimes, who do I look like? Because I'm looking at you, there's no reference point. And it's weird to me sometimes to look at her and to see traits of my sister living on in her. And then we do Who Am I before my kids leave every day for school. And that is just I can literally feel like my grandfather is in the room. There's not the smell of butterscotch or Werther's Originals, but that is in the room and that fills my well. Last word, what fills your well?
Oh man, I'm having so many feelings right now.
Do you want some Werther's Originals?
I might need some
get you
Werther's. Well, it was cool. The other week, my grandparents stopped by, and they're in their 80s, and they're trying to like clean all the things out of their house, which is nice of them. But they found all these photo albums, and they brought them to our house, and they had a lot of pictures of my mom, and so it was fun to look through that with my kids, and just have my Nana tell some stories and. They're never obviously going to know her, but it's neat to be able to see those stories live on in a different way. And so I think that's something that's filling my well. And I feel like just knowing that we get to keep building new stories as we go. So, my family may never look like I'm someone who has a living mother on this earth. I may not have an awesome, family of origin story. But what we can do as a family, my husband and I, is build something that is better and healing. And I think that does fill my well.
Yeah. Well, let's pray for those who may have the well half empty, maybe because of grief or from the loss of a loved one, or just grief because of the loss of things that are we're living through a season of challenge and loss. So we want to lift you up as we close our time together. Let's pray. God, we are so grateful for this space where we can be unfiltered, where we can unburden ourselves to you. There are things that we have deeply loved and have lost, and there are no good words that fill in that space. But there is a good God, a God who sits with us in that grief, a God who promises to walk with us as we navigate surprises and people who surprise us in the midst of challenging journeys. God, you are our healer, and we don't know always what that healing will look like, but we're grateful that you continue to heal us on this journey of grief. Help us to be wounded healers for others, and help us to create space and grace for ourselves. For we don't always move and do things according to plan. And sometimes grief, if anything, reminds us that our plans are not fixed. But God, you are still in the midst. You're still with us. And that is enough. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.